Our second topic of the day is exploring and understanding biodiversity. Our next two speakers will be discussing how collections are ideal for addressing questions of global concern relating to evolution, ecology, biodiversity science, climate change, habitat modification through human activity, threats from invasive species, and conservation efforts. Our first speaker is Dr. Sahas Barve, and it is my pleasure to welcome him to the stage. Sahas is currently the Program Director of Avian Ecology at the Archibald Biological Station. There he oversees a 55-year-long study of threatened Florida scrub jays. He is broadly interested in life history evolution of birds and enjoys communicating research with the public in new and innovative ways. It is my pleasure to welcome Sahas.
Hello, everyone. It's so great to be back, and thank you for inviting me, Rebecca. And it's wonderful to come here, see familiar faces. So I'm going to talk about something that I was studying here, and I want to start with a story about the sort of encounter that I had with this bird that inspired the research that I did at the Smithsonian. So this incident happened back in 2014 when I was doing my PhD research up in the Himalayas, and I was working at about 10,000 feet, and it was really, really cold. I was trying to get these winter observations of foraging ecology of Himalayan birds. It was about 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and I was out trying to, bundled in all the down and wool I had, trying to observe birds. And I basically couldn't see any birds. It was really, really cold until I saw this guy, a gold crest, very closely related to golden crowned kinglets here in North America. And this bird was foraging actively through a spruce tree. So I was like, okay, finally, some data. I took my hand out of my mitten, started writing, but my hand almost froze instantly, and I couldn't write anymore. And that's when it clicked that this bird was doing something incredible. So to give you reference, this bird is 6 grams in weight, so it's about a teaspoon of sugar, and the distance between the outside air, which was at 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and its heart, which is about an inch away from the outside air, it has to maintain the heart at 42 degrees Celsius, which is about 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And so it has to maintain this 90-degree difference between the outside air and its heart constantly, otherwise it goes into hypothermic shock. I, on the other hand, weighed a whopping 65,000 grams, and I still couldn't keep my hand warm. So I was thinking, okay, this bird is doing something really cool. Its puffed up feathers have something to do with it probably, and so I made a mental note that I needed to study feathers. I obviously couldn't make a physical note because my hand was numb. So that's basically the project that I proposed for my Peter Buck Fellowship here at the Smithsonian to Carla Dove, which can be paraphrased as, do Himalayan birds wear down jackets? So birds use their feathers, their metabolic rate, and multiple behaviors to keep warm. And I know there are some ornithologists here, but a lot of you don't study birds, and I guess no one's perfect, but let's go through some Feather 101 to understand what feathers are. So most birds have 3 kinds of feathers: wing feathers, tail feathers, and what are called contour or body feathers. Now, each of those contour feathers is made up of 2 parts. There is a downy part that's towards the base. It's also called the plumulaceous part. And that's made up of these non-interlocking barbs that are fuzzy and trap a pocket of warm air, keeping the bird warm. The other part of the feather is called the pennaceous part, and it is made up of interlocking barbs, which are the colorful part of the bird's feather and are also what keeps the bird waterproof, or water repellent at least. The main hypothesis in the literature when I started this study was that the proportion of the feather that is made up of these downy barbs should be greater in birds that live in cold areas. The other things birds can do is just layer up, right? They can wear multiple, so that each of their feathers are really long and they overlap with each other a lot, and basically make a really deep plumage. I wanted to study birds in the Himalayas because not only was I fond of that place, but mountain birds in general are really interesting and Himalayan birds in specific, for two reasons. One is that on a really long walk, in a day, actually, you can go from subtropical forests at about 5,000 feet to cold alpine tundra at 13,000 feet. And as you walk up the mountain, you go through a bunch of different environmental zones, right? So you go through, especially in the Himalayas, you go through subtropical forests, through oak forests, to rhododendron and spruce forests, and out onto what are called alpine meadows. So while the bottom of the mountain and top of the mountain are only a few miles away from each other, they are drastically different in their environments. And so I was really curious if birds can evolve changes in their feathers across this very small spatial scale. Himalayan birds are really interesting because Himalayas are a very young mountain range, and Himalayan birds, most of the taxa that live in the Himalayas, had already evolved in other parts of the world and then colonized the Himalayas as they were forming. And so Himalayan bird communities today are an admixture of temperate and tropical species, or taxa, that have now come together and have independently evolved to live in these high hypoxic places. So for the first part of my postdoc, I wanted to study whether feather structure changes along mountains. And again, the predictions were whether the proportion of down increases with elevation, whether temperate and tropical taxa show changes or differences in their feathers and their mechanisms for feather thermoinsulation, and whether small birds that lose heat much more quickly than large birds are just more insulated to keep warm. The National Museum of Natural History was, of course, a really great place to do this research because we have a huge collection of Himalayan birds. So I measured feathers on over 1,700 specimens of almost 250 species, did some stats on it, but found that irrespective of whether the bird was tropical or temperate, if you put a bird in a cold place, it evolves more downy, more insulated feathers. So irrespective of evolutionary history or evolutionary origin, as you go up the elevation, birds get more downy feathers. The other really strong pattern we found was that the relative length of feathers increases with a decrease in body size. So as birds get bigger, their feathers actually get shorter. So these small birds have long overlapping feathers that produce a deeper plumage, probably keeping the bird warmer. Okay, so we found these two big general patterns across 250 species, and so we were really curious and to understand whether these patterns hold on other mountains as well. And so I did some follow-up projects, one field project and a couple of museum projects to show these patterns exist not only in Himalayan birds, but also exist in Andean birds. But more importantly, they exist within species as well. So doing some comparative analyses for these Santa Marta wood wrens that live on this isolated mountain range in northern Colombia, Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, we showed that the high elevation wren had significantly more downy feathers than its very close relative, the low elevation Banks's wren. I also did a field season out in India in 2022 where we showed the same pattern for house sparrows as well. So house sparrows at low elevations have less downy feathers than house sparrows at high elevations. So these changes in feathers happen not only across species, but also happen within species. So the next time you see a bird that's all puffed up in your backyard, think about the cold environment that it is facing and how it's using its feathers to keep warm on a really cold day. As we were publishing this research, there were a couple of really interesting papers that came out that showed that not only was feather structure important for keeping a bird warm, but the color of the bird itself may have a role in thermoinsulation or thermal absorption. So there were some papers that showed that birds that were darker colored could absorb heat from the sun's light more than birds that were light colored. So again, going back and giving you a little primer, there are two parts of the bird's feather here. The pennaceous part, of course, we know changes. We know birds are multicolored. But the downy part can also be of different colors, mostly along a gray scale. So here are two specimens. And you can see that the top specimen has very light colored down, and the bottom specimen has very dark colored down. So both those parts of the feathers can have variable color. So the project I'm going to talk about now is part of the internships for two NHRE interns that I was really honored to mentor, Efrain and Mariana. A Smithsonian pre-doc, Kevin Bennett, also worked with me on this project, and a lot of the fun analyses I'm going to show was actually done by Alison Schultz, who's curator of birds at Natural Science Museum, LA. All right, so what we wanted to ask was, do high elevation birds have darker feathers and darker down to increase heat absorption from the sun? So we know that they have more downy feathers. Do they actually also have the color to absorb more heat? So for this, we used a subset of the specimens that we had used for the feather research that I just presented. And we measured the brightness of the down and the pennaceous part using a full spectrum spectrophotometer that Mariana was really cool at using, and she totally took the lead on measuring these specimens. And so we measured the brightness of plumage on the back and the breast of those 302 specimens of 152 species. So what did we find? I'm going to sort of paraphrase the findings. This is a little more complicated, but basically what we found was that small birds have darker down. So small birds, probably because they lose heat much faster, have darker down that likely not only absorbs heat, but is also, dark down might be also a little more, a little less vulnerable to degradation. So small birds have darker down. We did find that highland birds in general have darker down, again, showing that there is some relationship between dark down or darker colors and the cold environment of the mountains. What we did find was that pennaceous color was not related to cold environments. So birds, irrespective of where they lived and how cold it was, they could still be white or brown or red or black, as you would probably expect. And the coolest part was that down color was not related to the feather structure, which means that birds may have dark down, which might increase the absorption of heat, but that doesn't mean that they have more downy feathers or vice versa. So the structure of the down is not always related to the color of the down. Okay, so big takeaways from this research is that birds have repeatedly evolved downy feathers on high mountains of the world. So a lot of these birds that have independently evolved to live at high elevations have independently evolved, hundreds of species have evolved more downy feathers at high elevations. Highland birds have evolved heat-absorptive dark down independent of their downy feathers. So birds might have downy feathers, dark down, or both. And like everyone in DC knows, optics are everything. And so the color of the pennaceous region is independent of how cold it is. So the pennaceous part of the feather is probably not driving the thermoinsulative properties of the feathers to a great extent. I did want to wrap up today's talk by talking a little bit about the incredible opportunities I had as a Peter Buck Fellow here at the museum. Not only did I have a great team to work with in the bird division and the feather lab, I had the most amazing boss, Carla Dove. She's incredible, gave me so much independence. But I also got to work with a lot of education and outreach experts who helped me gain a lot of skills in how to do education and outreach as a scientist, how to translate my science for the general public. I was able to do really cool things like social media takeovers. I did several Science How with Maggie Benson, and I think I see several faces here who are in this photo. I gave several museum tours to interested people. I even did some really cool online programming and worked with museum experts to actually work on a museum exhibit together called Our Places. And all these experiences were just phenomenal. I had the opportunity to mentor amazing NHRA interns, and Sam and Mariana are both now doing PhDs on museum specimens of birds at really cool places. But I was also mentored by a number of people outside the division who were really kind and patient and generous with their time, and helped me forge this career in biology. I really appreciate how people were so welcoming and supportive here. And with that, I'd like to thank the Feather Lab again for an amazing 3 years at the Smithsonian, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions for Sahas?
Hi, Sahas. Really cool stuff. I was wondering if you have any sense, so you showed nicely that the proportion of down can vary even within a species across a habitat gradient. Do you have any sense whether there is plasticity to that within an individual? So over the lifetime of the bird, would those feathers potentially change seasonally?
That's a great question, and there is some research with great tits in Europe where they did common garden experiments to show that birds that were in a cold area brought down to a warm area actually put on less downy feathers. So there might be some plasticity, but there's also, as I'm sure you know, plumage is also driven by stuff like body condition and a whole lot of other hormonal cues. So, but yes, there is likely some plasticity there.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Another Feather Lab question. I guess my question is, you said that the down absorbs the heat from the sun and the radiation from the sun, but the pennaceous feathers actually help to protect the bird from that. So what do you think the body or the physiology, the temperature of the bird has to do with that? Yeah,
that's a great question. It's totally fine that Carla is asking me that question because I haven't shared these results with her yet. These are like fresh off, like literally I got these results a few days ago. But yeah, so the question is if the pennaceous part of the feather is covering the downy part of the feather, how is the dark down absorbing the heat? And the answer is we are not fully sure. And so there's a couple of important things. One is that so birds can expose the downy part of their feather to quickly absorb some heat, but that other hypothesis that dark down might actually be an adaptation not only for absorption but also to reduce mechanical wear of the down. So these small birds might be having dark down so that their down doesn't degrade because birds they put on the new plumage in the fall, and then they have to keep that plumage until they molt again. So a small bird doesn't want to have degraded down because it uses it to keep warm. Yes.
I was wondering, for these Himalayan birds, what are the advantages to them evolving their feather structure to live in these cold environments rather than just traveling to warmer climates?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we don't quite know why birds why birds breed at these high elevations, because there are a lot of other constraints on their biology also. So it's not only just cold and hypoxic, but even it's much more difficult to incubate eggs at really high elevations as well. But the general assumption is that there are fewer parasites and fewer predators at high elevations. And so some birds have evolved the physiology that lets them breed at those high elevations and probably have fewer diseases, fewer parasites, and less predation.
Hi, Sahas. Thanks
Hi.
very much. Is there any degradation in color in museum collections relative to the living birds, which is really a backdoor way of asking you to teach me what's responsible for color? How does it occur in feathers?
Thank you for that question. So yeah, so we don't see a lot of degradation of colors. The only bird that I've seen change color, and I've asked this to a number of different curators around the world, the common green magpie is green when it's collected, but becomes blue in specimens over time. So, but other than that, I think, and this happens in museums all over the world. But other than that, the colors are really, really vibrant and they don't degrade a lot. So to the second part of your question is, bird feathers there's 3 different ways in which birds have feathers. They have melanin that produces, just like you and me, they have black browns made from melanin. They have carotenoid colors that are the oranges and reds and yellows that are produced by them eating something orange, yellow, and red. And so, for example, if you starve a cardinal of all carotenoids, they put on brown plumage. And then the blues and the iridescent colors are what are called structural colors, and so they are tiny microscopic flecks of color layered on the barbs, and so they actually change color dependent on the angle of the light that is incident on them. So. Cool.
Thank you, Sahas, for a wonderful demonstration of the power of museum collections and really elegant science.